The studio lights burned bright as the broadcast went live, cameras capturing every detail. On one side of the table sat Karoline Leavitt, her posture sharp, her smirk deliberate. Across from her was Ibrahim Traoré, calm but steady, the weight of his nation visible in his shoulders. The program's host set the stage. Tonight, we bring together voices from two very different worlds, America and Africa. Let's talk about leadership, democracy, and the future. Karoline leaned forward, her voice crisp. Let's be honest. Africa still depends on Western guidance. Without us, your nations would crumble. You may call yourselves independent, but in reality, you're still learning to walk. Her words dripped with condescension, carefully chosen to sting. The studio audience murmured, some shifting uncomfortably. Traoré did not interrupt. His eyes narrowed slightly, but his expression remained composed. He had faced soldiers, coups, and foreign pressure. A live television debate was just another battlefield. He raised his chin, silently waiting for her to finish. Karoline pressed harder, sensing the spotlight. Look at the facts. Infrastructure, technology, investment, all roads lead back to us. Africa doesn't hold the keys to its future. We do. She glanced at the camera, as though sealing her words into history. The host turned to Traoré. Mr. President, what do you say to that? The room fell silent. This was the moment the audience had been waiting for. Traoré leaned slightly forward, his deep voice steady but sharp. Africa is not a child in need of lessons. We are nations with history, dignity, and strength. And tonight, you will learn that we bow to no one. The words struck like thunder. Gasps filled the studio, and the debate had only just begun. Karoline's smile widened as she leaned back in her chair, refusing to let Traoré's words settle without a counterattack. Bold speeches don't change reality, she said, her tone cutting through the tension. Your nations are unstable, your economy's fragile. Without Western backing, you wouldn't survive a year. You speak of strength, but what strength is built on aid and foreign loans? Her voice grew sharper, designed to push Traoré into anger. The audience buzzed, some nodding in agreement, others frowning at her dismissal. The host raised an eyebrow, sensing the debate was heating up. But Traoré didn't flinch. His face remained calm, though his eyes burned with defiance. Slowly, he adjusted the microphone in front of him, his movements deliberate. Ms. Leavitt, he began, his voice deep and unshaken, when you speak of Africa, you speak as though we are helpless. But it is your own fear that makes you speak this way. You fear what happens when Africa rises without your permission. A ripple went through the crowd. Karoline's smirk faltered for a second. Traoré continued, his voice steady, each word landing like a blow. Our people build with their hands, they endure storms, and they rise after every attempt to break them. We do not need your loans to breathe, and we do not need your permission to live free. If we were as weak as you claim, why then do you fear our independence so much? The camera zoomed in on Karoline's face. Her eyes flickered with irritation, her polished confidence starting to crack. She tried to interrupt, but Traoré raised his hand slightly, commanding the room's attention without force. This is not about aid, Traoré declared firmly, this is about dignity. And dignity cannot be given or taken by outsiders, it is owned by the people themselves. The audience erupted into applause. Some even stood. The host tried to calm the room, but the studio was alive with energy. For the first time, it was clear, this debate was no longer one-sided. Karoline leaned closer to her microphone, her voice sharp and defensive. So now you lecture me on fear? Let's be clear, Africa is still plagued with corruption, violence, and instability. You talk about dignity, but dignity doesn't build roads, it doesn't feed children, it doesn't create stability. Without Western order, Africa would collapse into chaos. The words landed heavy, intended to strike at every stereotype, every wound. Some in the studio audience gasped, others clapped nervously, unsure whether they were supporting her or the audacity of her statement. Traoré's jaw tightened, but his expression remained composed. He let the silence stretch, forcing every listener to dwell on the weight of her accusation. Then he leaned forward, his voice lower, controlled, but carrying the power of conviction. You see, that is the problem. You mistake exploitation for order. You confuse control with stability. And when you look at Africa, you only see what you want to see, not what we truly are. The audience shifted, leaning in. His words began to reshape the room. When you say we are nothing without you, you are not describing Africa. You are describing your own dependence, your dependence on our resources, our minerals, our lands, our labor. Without Africa, where would your wealth come from? Where would your industries stand? The truth is, it is not us who cannot survive without you. It is you who cannot survive without us. The studio exploded with applause. Even those who had earlier nodded at Karoline's remarks now found themselves caught in the storm of Traoré's words. Karoline tried to laugh it off, shaking her head, but her smirk no longer carried confidence, it carried discomfort. She opened her mouth to respond, but the noise of the audience drowned her out. The camera zoomed in on Traoré, his face illuminated by the studio lights. He didn't need to raise his voice, his calm tone had already stolen the stage. Africa is not your project, he finished firmly. We are our own destiny. And no one can belittle that truth. The host looked from Karoline to Traoré, realizing this debate was transforming into something larger than politics. It was becoming a battle of narratives, live before the world. Karoline adjusted her microphone and leaned forward, her voice sharpened with frustration. You make it sound heroic, but let's not twist the facts. Africa's wealth doesn't mean strength. Without systems, without governance, without Western leadership, your resources only feed corruption and conflict. That's the difference, we build order, you build chaos. The word struck like a dagger, the studio falling into a tense silence. She locked eyes with Traoré, convinced she had regained the upper hand. But Traoré didn't blink. His gaze was steady, almost piercing, as though he was seeing through her performance rather than reacting to it. He let the silence linger, then spoke in a voice calm yet resonant. Order built on chains is not order. It is oppression. The audience stirred. Traoré's voice gained weight as he continued, you speak as though Africa has not known governance, as if we are incapable of building systems. But before colonialism, before exploitation, Africa had civilizations, kingdoms, laws, and traditions that thrived for centuries. Your version of order dismantled them, and then you called us broken. Karoline's lips tightened, but Traoré pressed forward, each word echoing like a hammer striking steel. When you say our resources fuel corruption, you ignore the truth. It is not Africans flying in private jets to sell gold and diamonds in secret. It is not Africans writing the contracts that strip us of value. It is outsiders. Outsiders who preach order, but practice theft. A wave of applause rolled through the audience. Some stood, clapping louder, forcing the cameras to pan across the energized crowd. The tension had shifted once again. Traoré wasn't just defending Africa, he was exposing hypocrisy live on air. Karoline glanced at the host, desperate to interject, but the host, sensing history unfolding, gestured for Traoré to continue. The president leaned closer to his mic, his eyes unwavering. Do not call us chaos when it was you who brought storms. Africa is not chaos. Africa is survival. And survival is the truest form of strength. The studio erupted, louder than before, a storm of cheers and applause that shook the walls. Karoline leaned forward again, her smirk returning as she attempted to regain her confidence. Strong words, Mr. Traoré, she said, her tone dripping with condescension. But speeches don't change the facts. Africa still depends on the West for aid, for trade, for security. You claim independence, but your people line up for foreign help every day. Without us, the lights go out, the shelves go empty, and your so-called strength crumbles. The room quieted as her words echoed. For a moment, it seemed as if she had struck a nerve, her statement sharp and deliberate, meant to diminish everything Traoré had built in the debate. But Traoré didn't flinch. He leaned in, his face calm but his tone cutting like a blade. "Ms. Leavitt, let's be clear," he began, his voice steady. "It is not Africa that depends on the West, it is the West that depends on Africa. Your aid is a fraction of what you take. Your trade is built on unfair terms, and your security thrives on keeping us unstable. What you call help is nothing more than a leash disguised as charity." The audience shifted, murmuring in agreement. Traoré's words grew sharper, his delivery firm. "You talk about lights going out. Yet who extracts the uranium from Niger? Who takes the oil, the gold, the cobalt, and sells it at 10 times the price? Africa's resources keep your lights on, not the other way around. And you call us dependent?" Applause broke out again, louder this time. Some audience members even stood, clapping and cheering, the sound nearly drowning out Karoline's frustrated attempts to interject. Traoré raised his voice just enough to cut through the noise, his eyes locked on her. "We are not begging. We are building. And what you fear most is the day Africa stands on its own, because when that day comes, it will be you who cannot survive without us." The studio shook with thunderous applause. Karoline's composure cracked, her forced smile betrayed the tension in her eyes. For the first time, she looked cornered, her words insufficient to reclaim the stage. The cameras lingered on Traoré, his figure steady under the lights, his presence unshaken. The message was clear, this was no longer a debate, it was a reckoning. Karoline gripped the armrest of her chair, her polished confidence cracking under the weight of Traoré's words. Yet she forced a sharp laugh, masking the tension. "So, that's the story you tell yourself? That Africa holds the power? If that were true, why is it always your leaders at our doors, begging for loans, pleading for investment? You talk of dignity, but the truth is, without us, you have no stage, no spotlight, no voice." The words stung, designed to belittle not just Traoré, but the entire continent he represented. The audience fell silent again, waiting to see if the young leader would stumble. But Traoré leaned forward, eyes blazing with quiet fire. His tone dropped lower, carrying a dangerous clarity. "Ms. Leavitt, you confuse begging with manipulation. It is your system that creates debt and then offers loans as if you are saviors. You break our legs, then sell us crutches, and call it generosity." The crowd erupted in gasps and murmurs. Traoré pressed on, his voice gaining rhythm and power. "You say we have no stage. But the only reason you are watching me tonight, the only reason this debate matters, is because Africa does have a voice, one loud enough to make you feel threatened. If we were truly voiceless, you wouldn't waste your time trying to silence us." Karoline shifted uncomfortably, her smirk fading into a tight line. Traoré's hand rested firmly on the table as he continued, "Understand this, we don't need your spotlight. We are building our own. And when that light shines, it will expose every shadow where you have hidden your control. That is what you fear." The studio audience thundered with applause, some even chanting Traoré's name. The cameras caught Karoline's flushed expression, her attempt at composure slipping further. For the first time, the host leaned forward with visible excitement, sensing history in the making. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said over the applause, "this debate has become more than words, it has become a clash of worlds." And as the crowd roared, Traoré sat calmly, his posture unshaken. He wasn't just defending Africa, he was reshaping the narrative before millions of eyes. Karoline took a deep breath, her voice sharper now, almost desperate to regain control. "You speak boldly, Mr. Traoré, but boldness doesn't equal progress. The truth is, without Western systems, your countries collapse into chaos. Look at the instability, the coups, the poverty, that's what comes when you try to run without us. Africa can shout all it wants, but in the end, it always returns to the West for order. The studio fell into uneasy silence. Some in the audience nodded cautiously, others frowned, sensing the insult in her words. Karoline's tone had shifted from condescension to outright attack, her strategy clear: corner Traoré by painting Africa as unfit to govern itself. But Traoré's response was swift and unyielding. He leaned forward, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. Chaos, Ms. Leavitt? Do you dare lecture Africa about chaos? His eyes locked on hers, unwavering. Who drew the borders that split tribes and nations? Who armed warlords, sponsored coups, and robbed us blind for generations? The chaos you speak of was manufactured, by those who now pretend to be our rescuers. The audience gasped. The words cut through the tension like a blade. Traoré didn't pause, his momentum built with each phrase: you talk of poverty. But who drains billions in resources every year, leaving pennies in return? You call us unstable, yet it was your interference that set fire to stability. Don't confuse your exploitation with our weakness. The studio erupted in cheers and applause. The camera zoomed in on Karoline, whose face had tightened, her earlier smirk now replaced by a grimace. Traoré's final words landed like a hammer: Africa is not returning to the West. It is the West that will soon come knocking, desperate to return to Africa. And when that day comes, you will find the door closed. The roar from the audience was deafening. Even the host looked stunned, his eyes wide as he glanced between the two. The power dynamic had shifted completely. Traoré sat back, calm and resolute, while Karoline struggled to mask the tremor in her composure. The debate was no longer about words, it was about history, truth, and the courage to speak it aloud. Karoline's patience snapped. Her voice rose, sharp and cutting, as she leaned toward the microphone. Big speeches don't build nations, Mr. Traoré. You can dress your words in fire, but without action, they're empty. Africa keeps talking about independence, yet every time there's a crisis, you reach out to the same powers you condemn. That's not strength, that's hypocrisy. The studio filled with a tense silence. Some audience members nodded, others frowned, sensing both the sting of her words and the arrogance behind them. Karoline smirked, believing she had found her opening. But Traoré's reply was immediate, his tone steady and unflinching. You call it hypocrisy. I call it survival. For decades, Africa has been forced to play in a rigged game, one where the rules were written in European capitals and American boardrooms. But today, something has changed. We are no longer asking permission to survive. We are building the future on our terms. He gestured to the audience, his voice growing stronger. Look around you. Across Africa, young people are inventing, innovating, creating solutions without your aid, without your approval. They are proving that our progress doesn't need Western applause to be real. You say words don't build nations, but it was your words, written in false promises and empty treaties, that shackled us for generations. Now it is our words, backed by our will, that will free us. The crowd erupted into applause, clapping and cheering louder than before. The host raised his eyebrows, clearly astonished at the force of the exchange. Karoline tried to interject, but Traoré pressed on, his eyes locked on her. You accuse us of reaching out to you in crisis. But tell me, Ms. Leavitt, who created those crises? Who destabilized governments, drained resources, and called it foreign policy? We do not need lectures about hypocrisy from those who have mastered it. The studio shook with applause, some people even standing. Cameras zoomed in on Karoline's stiff expression, her jaw tight. The debate was slipping away from her grasp, and the world was watching it happen in real time. Karoline leaned in, her voice sharper now, trying to push Traoré into a corner. Strong words, Mr. Traoré. But history tells a different story. When Africa resists, it bleeds. When it stands alone, it falls. That's why every generation ends up returning to the same partners you condemn today. Without us, you'll repeat the same failures again and again. The audience murmured, the tension rising. Some whispered agreement, but many shifted uncomfortably at the sheer arrogance of her statement. The host glanced nervously between the two, sensing the debate was reaching its peak. Traoré's face hardened, his voice rising with controlled power. You call it history. I call it manipulation. You speak as though Africa has failed on its own, when in truth it has been strangled by the very hands now claiming to save it. If we bled, it was because your policies drained us. If we fell, it was because you pulled the ground from beneath us. The studio went silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Traoré didn't stop. Every empire in history has told the same lie, that their rule is necessary, that others cannot stand without them. But empires always collapse, while nations endure. Africa is not a pawn in your history books. We are writing our own. A wave of applause thundered across the studio, drowning out Karoline's attempt to respond. Cameras zoomed in on her frustrated expression, her lips pressed into a thin line as she struggled to find words. Traoré leaned back slightly, his voice calm but piercing. You say we'll return to you. No, Ms. Leavitt. Africa is not walking backward. It is moving forward, and this time, we walk without chains. The audience exploded into cheers, some even chanting Traoré's name. The host tried to restore order, but the energy in the room was electric. For the first time, it was clear, the debate had slipped entirely from Karoline's control. Karoline's voice cracked with frustration. You're dreaming, Mr. Traoré. The West is reality. Without our markets, your resources are worthless. Without our systems, your nations are powerless. You may inspire a crowd today, but when the lights go out, you'll still come knocking at our door. The words rang across the studio like a final attempt at dominance. She leaned back with a smug smile, convinced her closing jab had landed. But Traoré's reply came like a thunderclap. He stood, his presence commanding the entire room. Our resources are not worthless, Ms. Leavitt, they are priceless. That is why the world has fought for centuries to steal them. But here is the truth, Africa does not need your markets. Your markets need Africa. Without our gold, your banks weaken. Without our oil, your machines stop. Without our rare minerals, your technology collapses. The crowd erupted in applause, the sound shaking the studio walls. Karoline's smile faltered, her eyes darting nervously toward the cameras. Traoré raised his hand, silencing the room just enough for his last words to strike. You call your dominance reality. But reality is changing. It is Africa that will decide who knocks, and who is left outside the door. We bow to no one, and we will never beg again. The studio exploded into cheers, some audience members standing and chanting his name. The host struggled to contain the energy, but it was clear, the debate was over, and Traoré had won not just the room, but the moment. Karoline sat frozen, her earlier smirk now replaced with disbelief. For the first time, she realized, the old narrative was slipping away, and the world was hearing Africa's voice loud and clear.